The human species has a well-known problem that is popularly diagnosed by an English aphorism that says, "Don't shoot the messenger." Apparently, in order not to be monsters, we need regular reminding to not simply blame the social and emotional impact of a message upon the poor fool who first brought it to our attention. Friedrich Nietzsche, for example, and very famously, was trying to find a solution to the problems of nihilism and the death of God. But many people treat him as an advocate or prophet of these very concepts, simply because he was the first or most interesting or most famous individual from whom they initially heard about it. Don't shoot the messenger. A similar scenario exists in the science of physics. Citizens of 20th century Western modernity were reminded of their own uncertain emotions and their own haunting sense of ontological insecurity when they heard about Heisenberg's uncertainty theorem in quantum mechanics. They reacted to the name, to the package, to the format of the message, with very few of them noticing that this idea was at the heart of arguably the greatest leap forward of precision and certainty in the entire history of human knowledge. The true message was perhaps the opposite of how the packaging made them feel. I mention all of this as a way of introducing the great physicist Albert Einstein, who similarly is often blamed for ushering in an age of general relativity, when in fact he was the very person working most diligently to overcome the problem of relativism and the problem of context-based perspectival physics. Relativity entered physics with Galileo at the dawn of modern science. He made it clear that specific physical facts and measurements change depending on the position and movements of the measuring equipment. Weight and speed and distance are objectively different in different contexts. Einstein did not like this relativity, even though it is obviously real. And whatever limitations to his thinking may be discovered by daring future mathematical physicists, his solution to overcome relativism without canceling its truth was enormously successful. By successful, I mean that it immediately allowed us to build new machines and predict real things about the universe that no human eye had as yet ever seen. So this iconic, peace-loving German Jewish socialist with the funny hair and the gleam in his eye found a way to accomplish the essential task of all integrative meta-theory and coherent pluralist philosophy. He worked out the shapes and the numbers that could directly empower human understanding and socio-technological revolutions by making all the relative perspectives intelligible to each other within a shared and consistent reality. How did he do this? Well, it involved long periods of pondering the acceleration of pure light. The acceleration of light speed is the same no matter from which perspective you happen to be viewing it. This special rate of change, whether in the movement of photons or gravity waves, is jokingly referred to as the cosmic speed limit. It is the interperspectival boundary condition, the limit of the transmission of changes that can be registered as meaningfully distinct within any relative context. No matter where you are or how fast you are moving, the acceleration of light never gets any closer or slower. And anything traveling that fast doesn't even experience time, which is yet another way of saying that we are discussing the structural limit of changes intrinsic to every observer. I'm belaboring this tiny physics lesson because the generalized concept toward which it points is extremely significant. To make any map or worldview that accepts the reality of plural perspectives and then exceeds that reality into useful transperspectival coherence, we must anchor ourselves in the boundary or limit condition that exists between, beyond, and within all particular contexts. Many theorists and visionaries have asserted great superspaces or hyperdimensions, but that will always be somewhat of a fantasy unless it is shown to emerge as the natural and rational byproduct of the interperspectival impossibility itself. We require a beyond that is in between, and a difference that is implicit to identities. So that which breaks every frame and upon which every frame depends is a factor that can operate as a medium of translation between all frames. The precise parallax becomes a means of establishing the fluctuations of sameness and difference across multiple frames of reference. This is a very powerful idea. It is the idea that the impossible limit shared between two fields of interpretation can give us access to higher practical knowledge of reality. Patterns of sense-making that obey this kind of logic are what I call metaphemes. In science, they exist as quantitative structures, and in what we call the humanities, they exist as qualitative metaphemes, particular instantiations of adjacency. Perhaps we could think of them as conceptual origami, folded from out of the irreducible and interlocking proximity of opposites that provides the non-dual functionality of the cosmos. But since this is a slippery concept, let's explore its shape from a number of different angles. The author, activist, and philosopher Arthur Koestler, who coined the term holon, which would go on to have enormous utility in the works of integrative metatheory, describes in his book The Act of Creation how discoveries in art, comedy, and science all emerge where two different planes of meaning, two different fields of contextual interpretation, intersect and converge in a particular structure that reveals a higher order understanding that cannot be grasped only from either perspective. It is the shape of their mutual ignorance, and at the same time the unveiling of their commonality as extensions of a deeper sense-making pattern. The enactment of meaningful emergence in structure has this shape, which simultaneously limits and fulfills whatever perspective you are embodying by making transparent the fact that it applies or belongs equally to some other frame of reference. This ambiguity or disagreement about the provenance of the pattern, this thwart to the consistency of an embodied perspective, may initially appear to be an interference from another perspective, but this interference is actually shared reciprocally between them. It is something they have in common. In the mutuality of the shared incompleteness, we lay our hands upon a factor that could legitimately be claimed as interperspectival and then transperspectival. Let us return to Heisenberg's uncertainty theorem, also known as the indeterminacy principle. We find there that position and momentum cannot be perfectly disentangled in the material physics of objective reality. Two great fields of sense-making, namely knowledge of location and knowledge of movement, are inextricably linked and limited by each other in a very precise amount. A specific fraction of the number known as Planck's constant defines the shared horizon or boundary between where you are and how fast you are going. Normally, speed and location are quite different, but that's not entirely accurate. When looked at with more nuance, we see that these are in fact a single piece of information whose contextual differences vanish when we perceive the exact way in which they interfere with each other. So we might say that the hyphenated object called position momentum is a single quantitative metapheme. Two alternative variables operate in complementarity with each other, adjusting their values in a manner that is limited by the other. You never get all of both values because they are, in a certain sense, the same complex value. It is a structure of transduality defined by the particular adjacency or incomplete proximity that perfectly but imperfectly connects them. In this case, it is a particular fraction of Planck's constant that says how close these inextricably connected and flexible contexts of information can get to each other without collapsing. It's the same for Einstein's idea of the entangled space-time. Glimpses of these metaphemic structures are common in higher-order quantitative domains like physics, but also in higher-order philosophical syntheses. The work of Ken Wilber in the field of integrative metatheory is densely populated with such structures. For example, consider the way that he frames the axis of meaningful developmental emergence. He postulates that simpler structures are meaningful in the sense of being more fundamental, more basic, but complex structures are meaningful in the sense of being more significant. This axis of meaningfulness places the concept of being fundamental to the cosmos and the concept of being significant to beings within a single hyperconcept. They are considered to be not two independent variables, but two co-varying variables that limit each other, require each other, are intimately close to each other, but which cannot cancel or be reduced to one another. This is also how Wilber thinks about subjective and objective reality. They are overlapping, co-arising, intimately entangled, and neither of them can be maxed out at the other one's expense. The dimension of subject-object is a metapheme considered in this manner. Another metapheme is the many one, the singular plural dimension. A multitude is built out of single things, but as the French philosopher Alain Badiou has demonstrated, any one thing presupposes a set of things counted as one. You cannot have one without a certain residual manyness, nor can you have manyness without singularity as at least its comparative context. They exist in tandem, even in their opposition, right down to a certain threshold of intense adjacency to each other that cannot be removed and provides a shared limit condition between them. Einstein's great friend Kurt Gödel elaborated the incompleteness theory that proves the degree of consistency of any logical theory, how well it operates together, and the degree of its completeness or inclusivity can never both be 100%. You either lose a little consistency, and so it isn't completely logical, or you lose a little completeness, so it doesn't apply to everything. This limit is not bad news. It means that just like position and momentum in quantum mechanics, we have a more accurate way of understanding reality by specifying that two different approaches are mutually limited by a particular degree. Completeness and consistency are in fact one piece of complex information. When you pull from the left side, you lose a little on the right, and vice versa. This sounds strange, but it's actually quite accessible in simple forms. Many children play with a so-called Mobius strip. That's a simple twisted loop in which the outside and inside trade places in seamless continuity without ever ceasing to be separate and opposed to each other. One could hardly ask for a better mathematical and geometrical description of non-duality. The difference is both transcended and conserved, but not in some vague fashion, not merely in principle. It is actual and factual with precise mathematical and architectural variables. So the Mobius strip provides a convenient, well-known example of metaphemic structure. And you might imagine that the lines that separate segments on Ken Wilber's famous four-quadrant grid are not lines, but actually more like these mobioid strips that define the mutual positioning and co-enactment of superficially opposed variables. Imagine it like a thermometer, a gradient of temperature. But instead of this thermometer depicting a single variable such as the degree of heat, instead imagine two different complementary variables at the top and the bottom. For example, imagine the degrees of this thermometer run between order and chaos. Now give it a twist, and like a Mobius strip, connect the two opposite ends together. This gives a closer approximation of the structure of a metapheme. You can move up and down on the scale of order-chaos, getting more of one or more of the other, moving them further or closer apart, but you can never perfectly fuse or perfectly disentangle them, nor can you ever have one without at least a residual degree of the other. I can have more or less order, but I cannot have no order. Even perfect chaos would be somewhat worldly because it obeys a rule or constraint. It must be perfect chaos with no order. That distinction must be held. If no order is allowed, then at least one rule is obeyed and some order is required. It's similar to saying that no universal truth means there is at least one universal truth, which is that there is no universal truth. You always only have both, and they constrain each other and transform each other up to and including the full intensity of their incommensurability. An even more common example of the formal depiction of metaphemes is the ancient Taoist symbol of yin-yang complementarity. Yin and yang, which are general classes of reciprocal qualities, are portrayed as being harmoniously distinguished from each other and bound together by the same structure. Their division connects them, and it is displayed as a precise residual amount of the yang within the yin and the yin within the yang. A minimum degree of entanglement shows how close they are to each other, while also showing that neither can perfectly reduce to the other, or reduce the other, because they are aspects of a common structure, sutured together at the place where their definitions limit each other. The yang qualities are constantly and variably related to the yin qualities, but below a certain threshold, or we might say at a certain intensity of adjacency, it can no longer function as yang and passes into yin. The same is true of yin. They mutually bind each other at this horizon. I refer to these kinds of patterns as metaphemes, and that just means the things, the stuff, the themes that characterize the meta view from the in-between and beyond. The types of structures or entities or changes, depending on the grammatical modality we're using, that inhabit vision logic space are these metaphemes. They are the shapes of sense-making that distinguish and organize post-formal cognition. So what are the possibilities for extending the study of metaphemes? One area is important to this work in particular, and that's modal diversity between types of metaphemic structures. The hyphen in the word position momentum, for example, may not be identical to the virtual between also perhaps in the title of this book, or in the word indiscernible, or in the implied separator connector within a word like non-duality. So one area of philosophical research may be zoological in the sense of exploring the different species and flavors of metaphemes. Another open territory will be that of multipolar metaphemes. The Mobius strip and the yin-yang symbol are both predicated upon the discovery of post-formal vision logic objects that bind and identify two complementary opposites into functional mutual incompleteness and self-differential entanglement. 2 is a very convenient and small number. It's thinkable for us. It's very difficult for human brains to think about 3-valent Mobius triangles or 15 variable objects. That doesn't mean these objects do not exist. Computer modeling and complex mathematical topologies reveal objects of this kind, but we have yet to strongly correlate them to conceptual and qualitative patterns in human experience, so there is an open field for exploration there. How can we extend and locate these patterns in more diverse domains? That is a very interesting question. Does falling in love require a perfect or particular overlap between my incomplete knowledge of you and your incomplete knowledge of me? Is there a role for metaphemes in morality, in emotion? It may be so. There's also the question of which variables are actually conjoined in a metaphemic manner. It is unlikely, for example, that a cow's udder and the stock market are reciprocally adjacent in some reliable structural manner. The number of metaphemes in reality will always be less than the number of possible combinations of variables, in much the same way that there will always be fewer holons than heaps in integral theory, and fewer natural sets than possible sets. The north and south poles of a polarized field relate in a manner that is distinct from just two arbitrary variables, such as an artificial pink flamingo penis and the number 7.5. But is there some general theory or principle that can describe why certain variables may be interconnected aspects of the self-difference of a vision logic object, and others may not be? That is worth exploring. There is a more immediate area of study found in the Archdisciplinary Research Center's work, which has begun to examine what they call arches, or the resonances between differently named but similar features of diverse metatheories and diversely sourced transdisciplinary models of reality. What are the basic metaphemes that are typically discovered by different transdisciplinary philosophers who synthesize multiple modes of perception, such as reason and vision? I've long been a proponent of what I call the grab bag approach. That means that no matter how impressed you are by the big picture map of a particular meta-theorist working to provide a comprehensive, best fit image of the diverse modes of enactive perspectives, that the pieces of their model will always be more important than the particularities of how they have arranged them all. The grab bag of metaphemes that they have repeatedly detected can be arranged in a certain way, but there may be other ways to arrangement, and there may be metaphemes that they have not yet encountered, but are found in someone else's model. So it is important to start thinking in terms of a general class of integrative metatheories, and especially of the metaphemic bricks out of which these cathedrals of mind are being built. And a natural extension of that work will be the possibility of an automated system that can spin up coherent pluralist reality maps in according to particular individual needs and world contexts. I've summarized a koan-like principle that joins non-dual states of consciousness to advanced structural and symbolic depictions of reality in the phrase, "the separator is the connector." The fence that divides your house from your neighbor also directly links your two properties. The same structure is doing both tasks as it mediates the degree of the adjacency. These patterns are encountered in everyday life as oddities or humorous indicators of paradox, but they need not be relegated to mystical ambiguity. Mathematics and physics have already shown that very precise and useful formulations of metapheme structure are both possible and revolutionary and can be normalized as part of the general human educational project to enable sociological and existential growth beyond pluralism and regression. Metaphemes are the functional instantiations of a metaphysics of adjacency, which then must be analyzed as a multimodal field of enacted styles. In other sections of this work, therefore, we will be exploring the principles involved in these multiple modes using categories that describe a generalized, abstract set of the types of human grammar.